Hi guys, sorry about my audio in this one. There's some kind of problem with my audio interface and Zoom, and it makes my voice kind of really jumbled sometimes. I sound kind of weird, like a robot or an alien or something, which is maybe fitting for this interview, but a bit annoying. Fortunately, Marty's voice is fine, and he's doing most of the talking. I'm just asking the questions. So yeah. Also, if you're listening on the podcast and you want to see the video, you can check the link in the description. And if you're watching this as a video and you want the podcast, you can check the link in the description as well. And great chat with Marty about UFOs and just pretty much just about UFOs. Hope you enjoy. Great. All right. So very exciting. Today we have Marty Garza, International Hall of Fame monster truck driver and UFO expert, in my opinion, on the show. A couple of things to get out of the way up top. This is intended as a kind of follow-up, as a kind of supplementary podcast to the series that Marty has done on the Brothers of the Serpent podcast. I didn't want Marty to ask you all the same things you've kind of already been asked and to get to talk about all the same things and repeat yourself. So after listening to that, there was just some other stuff I wanted to kind of get into in more detail with you and ask you for your thoughts on. So a strange request, but I would say to anyone who hasn't, please listen to that series before listening to this, because otherwise it's kind of like jumping to series 5 or something of a TV show, you know. Are you still doing those? Yes. Is that kind of still ongoing? Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, to save the listeners a little bit of time, they can start probably around. We have a little there's mini series within our UFO series on Brothers of the Serpent, and we did one. I believe it's episode 213 and 14. Actually, it's 2. That might be a good primer for this conversation. It's episodes 213 and 14, A History of Unlikely Coincidences, part 1 and 2. That'll probably give your listeners a good place to start from, and they can then proceed through the subsequent episodes. And I think they'll find, as you know, that our approach to the phenomenon is rather unusual. It's a little more of a broad spectrum approach to the mystery. We try not to pigeonhole it into any one particular area, as you know. So yeah, I'm sure we'll get into the finer details of that, but I think that will give the listener at least some perspective of where these conversations will lead.
Yeah, that's the thing I like about it, is even if you don't necessarily feel the same way about it that you do, which I mean, I know you don't really pin that down too specifically anyway, but even if you don't feel that way, it's just a great sort of, it's just, I recommend it to anyone who I'm trying to get into the whole UFO thing, because it's just a great kind of rundown of so many different encounters and kind of adjacent things and other experiences that people have had. It's just even if you have a completely different opinion to you on it, it's just a great kind of resource, I think, to listen through and hear all of those things. But as you say, it's like you kind of have to take a broad spectrum approach, don't you? Otherwise, you're sort of, it is inherently such a broad topic that by trying to be too precise, and I guess people try to pin you down and make you say it's this or it's that, and it feels kind of wrong.
Yes, as you're very familiar with the podcast, we try to approach everything from the perspective of searching for answers, not beginning with a conclusion and then working backwards. I've been interested in the phenomenon, just to give your listeners a little bit of background. I've been interested in the phenomenon most of my life. I delved into it from a research perspective in the early 90s. I was an admin for back in the early mid 90s in the United States. There was a series called Encounters by Fox television that dealt primarily with the UFO phenomenon, and I was an admin for their online presence, and so I got to communicate with a lot of people. I got to meet a lot of really iconic people within the this area of research, Stanton Friedman and Bruce Maccabee, and some of the more prominent individuals at that time. And at that time, I approached the phenomenon, as many people do, from a very, I guess you could say, pragmatic approach, taking things at face value, because that's kind of the default position, right? And it leads people to what I guess we now would term that nuts and bolts approach to the phenomenon. Physical craft coming from, and connected with that is the extraterrestrial hypothesis, where this is an intelligence that is coming from another planet traveling here, and very in hindsight is somewhat of a simplistic viewpoint. But I was very deeply mired in that mentality for quite a long time. And as I got into other areas of business and life, I had to step away from my research for a while, and that period was somewhat of a reset. It allowed me to come back to it with fresh eyes, and as a result, and largely because of other life experiences, it allowed me to view it through a different lens, and that lens was much broader than what I had before. And as you noted, the phenomenon is so intrinsic, and from my findings, it's intrinsic to mankind, and it actually has connections to such a broad facets of our life that it is virtually impossible to view all of it at once. And it's a bit of a pitfall that I believe many people fall into, is that they look at a certain area of their research or certain cases, certain things. We tend to gravitate towards the familiar, so we will look at a certain aspect or a certain facet of the phenomenon and focus on that, and then try to develop theories or reach some form of conclusion about what the phenomenon really is, or how, whether it's physical, non-physical, if it's extraterrestrial or interdimensional, all these things. But fundamentally, the problem is that we tend to view it with blinders. Even when we might have an unusual perspective, it's still somewhat constrained, because the phenomenon is so vast. It's you almost can't. You have to pan your vision around to be able to view it all. You can't take it all in very easily. It takes decades of research and an open-minded approach to it to even begin to slightly understand what all could be going on, and those possibilities just get larger and larger. It seems as though the more you research it, the further you get from answers rather than getting closer. Yeah. But you're working with more information. So I think that any sort of speculation tends to become a little more educated speculation. It's not just a rash jump to conclusions. I think that is probably the most prevalent hurdle to understanding of the phenomenon, is that people tend to try to come to conclusions based on a tiny fragment of data that may not be truly be representative of what the phenomenon may actually entail.
Yeah, I mean, because it could be like 95% of it is this one thing, but there is another 5% that's something completely different that is throwing people off. Is there anything that, I mean, you are like, I guess, relatively open-minded about it anyway, but you have certain feelings and ideas about what this may or may not be. Is there anything that's come up that's kind of contradicted your perspective or caused you a lot of difficulty in kind of putting it into perspective? Is there any information that you've sort of had to grapple with?
Absolutely. In fact, the contradictions are a feature, not a bug of the phenomenon. In other words, it is comprised of contradiction. And I believe that's by design. I would say that rather than necessarily viewing the data and then trying to work towards a conclusion, I think it's more a function of filtering out the lesser likely things. In other words, there are certain explanations that become less likely when considering all of the data. And oddly enough, for me, and I recognize that my perspective might be quite different than many, especially those who have had certain types of firsthand encounters, because that is, and it's very understandable. In other words, a hypothetical scenario, an individual has a being or some form of physical encounter. They're told things or they're taken on board a ship, and they feel that they physically interacted with the phenomenon. They will have tend to have a more definite opinion of what the phenomenon entails, because it's somewhat tangible in that sense. And it is, again, it takes this broad spectrum approach to look at it, and then to have a conversation with an individual such as I just described and explain to them how that experience may not have been exactly the way they perceived it. There are certain things that may never have occurred to them, that this could be a manipulation of my perception. It could be a multitude of different things. And it gets even more complicated in that we are not, although from my perspective, the phenomenon, in quotation marks, represents a certain form of contact. I'm hesitant to call it a one thing, but it represents a type of contact scenario. But intermingled with that, we have governments either disinforming or using those type of things as cover for their activities. And so that complicates the picture. So now sometimes when you have these bits of contradictory information, some percentage of that may be because that's actually something somewhat different disguising itself as the phenomenon, and then you have the reverse, the phenomenon trying to present itself in a more familiar form that may be interpreted as something more prosaic, not necessarily totally prosaic, but more along the lines of normal day-to-day life. In fact, I think that there's even a part and parcel of this is the inability to see the forest from the trees. Some aspects of the phenomenon may be so intrinsic that we don't recognize them for being something external to us. I know that's a rather vague explanation, but that's where you have to listen to the whole series, and it's impossible. Again, for your listeners that may not be familiar, we're 13, 14 episodes into this, and every episode is 3.5 hours, because there's so much information. It's impossible to provide the listener with sufficient data to make a, somewhat good understanding of what they just listened to. Like, it has to be cut down into digestible pieces and cram as much data within that and then they're kind of segregated into things that are somewhat related, so that we're not just jumping back and forth between different facets that may represent slightly different aspects of the phenomenon, or different layers of them. When you sort of get a feel for where we're going with the series, you'll understand that the phenomenon is layered. There are different aspects within the phenomenon that may represent different factions from within the phenomenon of, whatever the phenomenon is. I know that these are very difficult concepts to convey in this kind of normally the way I do that. And again, for those that are not familiar, a lot of times when I'm asked questions like, "What do you think this is?" or "What's your feeling of this?" and I'm very hesitant to give a response. More often than not, what I do is I actually will present scenarios, historical cases and things like that will allow the listener to more or less draw their own conclusion. But, I'm giving them the information that's going to lead them in that direction, because it's easier to do that than to say outrageous things that sound like I'm just pulling a thought out of a hat and not really explaining why I arrived at maybe that view, right? So I'm trying to give different scenarios and saying, okay, here's a group of cases that might lead to this conclusion. And even then, that conclusion may be only a small fragment of something, even a larger picture.
Yeah, because if you do it the other way around, they're not even a lot of people won't even listen to the context, will they? If you don't give them the context before the idea, most people, I guess understandably, but sometimes a bit frustratingly, will just, a lot of the time, the average person probably will just laugh. Like, they don't really, when people don't have the context, it's hard to tell them how you really feel about it, isn't it? You mentioned the factions there. I wanted to get onto that, but also I wanted to go back to something you said about the contradictions being built into it. And I sometimes get a feeling, because there are so many kind of adjacent topics to this, and so many of these kind of, whether it's paranormal or conspiracy or supernatural, all these kind of different strange topics. And I guess now they're more and more present because of the internet. And I get really into a lot of these things, and the feeling I get, sometimes I have like obsessions with like religion or with ancient mysteries or with UFOs, and I go and get into one of these things for months, and I end up with the feeling like I'm supposed to be confused. Like, I'm supposed to. Do you in your research ever get the feeling that you're like kind of like a hamster on a wheel? Like no matter what you do, you will be fed mystery, and that's the point. Like, there's supposed to always be a certain, and once this mystery is kind of revealed, in the process, there will be that there's almost like in our existence or in life or in the universe, whatever, we're kind of supposed to be in the dark about something at all times. Do you get that feeling like it's kind of futile almost?
Yes, but I don't necessarily consider it futile. Even if you never arrive at an answer, it's still not futile. In other words, you're learning along the way, and that learning may touch different aspects of your life that may be seemingly completely unrelated to the phenomenon. It's almost as though it's a guide or a teaching force as well. It's more involved than some abstract, uninterested, the zoo hypothesis type scenario. I believe, based on the evidence, there's something more connected to our existence. And I don't pretend to know why. And it's entirely possible that the truth may be more complex than we are able to comprehend. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't necessarily say that I see futility in this, but I do recognize the contradictions, but I tend to learn from them. And my approach is one of pattern recognition. I try not to take anything at face value, even the most seemingly cut and dry scenarios. I still look at all the potentials, like how could this be a form of deception, or could this be a misinterpretation? For a variety of reasons. And the misinterpretations can be active or passive, or there can be an active intent to misrepresent or mislead. But even those things may have a reason that is not immediately apparent. And they may become apparent later. And I have certain stories that involve synchronicities and things like that kind of reinforce that perspective, that sometimes things happen for a reason. I mean, we hear this very often, right? Everything happens for a reason. But statements like that are based on certain things. Like with age, you have more life experience, so you get to gain a different perspective, and you recognize that things that may have happened decades ago that might have seemed extremely significant or may have been insignificant will have a very direct effect on things that happen much later on, that had that thing not happened, then this wouldn't have happened. And some of those, although many might seem very prosaic, some are quite profound, and some are rather hard to explain. They seem to go beyond chance. When you start stacking synchronicities on each other, and that sort of ties, I guess that little, it's a little fragment, that tying together of synchronicities, as though one is important, but two is trying to catch your attention, that to recognize that there's something more important than what it might appear. That aspect may have a connection to this contradiction thing, or some of the absurdity that's intrinsic as well. And I've heard this explained, or I've read this explained by Jacques Vallée, in fact. And I don't remember what the name of the term is, but I guess a scenario that somewhat presented is, imagine if you, it's kind of like a reset. Imagine that you're walking down the street and you bump into someone and they tell you something at random, like, probably is not a good idea to sign that contract you're working on, or something, or, hey, oh, by the way, that next week, don't eat that burger, or something, something just abstract, right? Something that 9 times out of 10, you wouldn't even pay attention to. It would not register, right? But all of a sudden, that little bit of information or opinion or whatever comes to you by way of some fantastical thing, a gnome, a fairy, or something out of the ordinary, right? Something that's not part of everyday life. And it's the same words, it's the same sentiment, but it's presented in this very unique way. And it sticks with you. And you're like, what was that all about? That may be part of what's going on. In other words, some of this may be presenting itself to make a distinction between our day-to-day ordinary life and this transitional state between realms, maybe between, even if the intelligence behind this is extraterrestrial in terms of from another planet, physical, its method of interacting with us may still be going through some non-physical state. And what we are physically encountering may only be some type of a manifestation or representation of something else. And it's also another point that I often make on the podcast is that the phenomenon itself may be completely unlike anything we've ever experienced. In other words, if you take every form of contact, be it, mystical creatures and aliens and, all these different things, ghosts, all sorts of apparitions, all of those could simply be manifestations of something entirely different that we've never actually physically encountered. Maybe it has no physical form to encounter. And these are just avatars or something in order for us to be able to interact, because a lot of times, your inner voice or, speaking to something intangible just makes you feel crazy. It doesn't make it seem real. But when something appears, and no matter how strange it may be, now it's an event, right? It's not just, oh, wow, I was light. I didn't have lunch that day, and I imagined that I got this information, that kind of thing. When there's a tangible event, it tends to stick with you. It might have a more profound effect. And if the phenomenon, as has been speculated, is some form of a guiding force, maybe that's why it requires certain types of interaction to steer, to act as guardrails, to keep, it's not, I wouldn't say that we're puppets on a string necessarily, but it may be acting as a guide. And maybe these kind of interactions just kind of keep nudging things along in a certain direction. I know these are radical concepts from what people are more accustomed to hearing. And that's another thing, that kind of relates to what we were talking about a little while ago, is that I think most people, when it comes to the phenomenon, because obviously the vast majority of the public don't know a whole lot about the phenomenon. They know what they hear through the media and all that. So I believe they're more accustomed to being told what to think rather than being given information that allow them to make their own decisions or formulate their own opinions.
Yeah, it struck me when you were talking about that. I mean, like, about it not being futile. I guess if you look at it purely from, and like you're trying to intellectualize it and figure out what's going on and come to firm conclusions, then perhaps in that sense it is. But I guess if you look at it as like also part of our own individual journeys as people in some way, then that level of mystery makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? Like perhaps it's like a way of maybe it's a way of testing us. It's a way of, I sometimes think with religion, like with mainstream religion, when all the rules are so clearly written out, it's kind of meaningless to follow them. When you're told, like, this is what's what, this is what God is, this is what you are, this is what you're supposed to do, this is how to be good, this is how to be bad, don't do this, do that. And it's so literal that it seems meaningless, like, to follow it. There's no, I don't know. I guess maybe a lot of the mystery in the phenomenon and other adjacent topics is kind of also, I mean, you mentioned a way of guiding people, or perhaps a way of keeping people in a certain space, for want of a better phrasing, to kind of see how we behave, or to allow us the freedom or the room to be who or what we are without such clear, firm boundaries that we maybe even in some other plane of existence we have. But maybe here and now, whatever this reality is, we don't have that, or that's taken away from us deliberately, perhaps.
Yeah, I some of a good percentage of what we present on the show is more historical and may be interpreted by some as unrelated, but to follow up with your thoughts there, another way to look at this, I guess I refer back to like the ancient Egyptian religion, their belief system, right? They believed that we were, upon death, judged. And you at that point, your soul had to be as light as a feather to get to the next realm, right? The next stage of life. So that concept can be applied to like a video game scenario where you are playing a game and the objective is to advance to the next level, and you encounter different battles along the way, and you have to defeat these certain obstacles to be able to move on. And it's not entirely impossible, since there are so many variations of that concept through many religions, going back as far as we have records, right? So perhaps those people had a better understanding of the framework we operate within than what we do today, with a far greater number of distractions and potentially other things. I'm trying not to give spoilers on where the podcast is going, but some other aspects of things that could be somewhat putting up stumbling blocks into this understanding. Not always purposeful. There does seem to be an aspect of the phenomenon that does put up obstacles to our understanding. I think that our listeners could at least understand the scenarios that I often present, where there appears to be at least two factions involved in the actual phenomenon, the legitimate phenomenon. Not, again, there are more. It's more complex than that when you start putting government agencies and even civilians that let's say are skeptical, and they intervene and create all these other. So it's it's like 3D chess, right? There's things happening at multiple levels, but when we're talking about the actual phenomenon, whatever this communication or interaction is, within that, we contend, or I wouldn't say necessarily, we present information or data that would lend people to believe that it appears that there are at least two factions within that, and there is some form of conflict between these. In fact, the basis for those who may not have read, there's a book called The Gods of Eden by William Bramley. And William Bramley is a military historian. He was writing this book on military conflict, and he was looking at a historical perspective. Why have, in the past several thousand years, there's never been a time when there isn't these conflicts, and he wanted to get to the root of why is there always conflict. And I was looking at my notes before this, and he says that in the book, it says, as I probed deeper, however, I was compelled to face the possibility that some human problems may be rooted in some of the most utterly bizarre realities imaginable. And he says, as a result of those problems, those realities are rarely resolved, and the world seems to stumble from one calamity to the next. And he says, I will admit that when I began this research, I had a bias, and that I was expecting to find a human profit motive or common thread from which links various third-party influences in mankind's violent history. What I found instead was the UFO. So here's a historian that knows nothing about UFOs, but in studying, conflicts throughout history, he found that there was always this paranormal aspect involved. And I contend that when you look into the history of religions, virtually all of them begin with some form of encounter with some type of non-human intelligence. And which that opens up a lot of questions, right? Why? This is something, one of the episodes, we did an episode called Revelations, and it involved it kind of gives a little bit of the origins of a number of different religions and these very strange encounter scenarios that occurred that led to these. And keep in mind that for every one religion we hear of, there are many that never got off the ground. That they built up for a short period and then collapsed, or they never really made it. They were regional or whatever. But when you look at these, it makes you wonder that if whatever is trying to guide mankind in some form, right? These encounters appear to have some interest in protecting mankind or guiding mankind, right? That's how it's presented. But rather than shoring up existing religions, they tend to create new ones constantly. And those invariably begin or end up in conflict with the ones that existed before. So either in this constant state, and I don't have to tell you that has led to.
When you say appearing, they appear to be trying to guide mankind in a positive direction. Do you mean there's an element of deception and they're not really trying to guide mankind, but that's the sales pitch kind of?
Well, there's definitely a sales pitch, right? There are so many, examples of this that I wouldn't necessarily say that they're all deceptions, but it would appear, again, if there was only one party involved, the phenomenon was one thing with one agenda, and in other words, that there was some very, straightforward intent. I think the messaging that we would receive, or that these individuals throughout history would be receiving, there would be consistency. But we don't seem to find that. We find certain, it appears as though there are elements of intended conflict.
Yeah.
They're creating factions within factions within factions that invariably cause problems. And I'm trying to not get into religion or per se any specific religions, but fundamentally, I mean, you can say that you could call this black and white or good and evil or whatever. In other words, I try not to use labels, but in this case, there is a team A and team B, or, positive and negative or something. There appears to be opposing forces here. And humanity appears to be caught in the middle of some sort of conflict. And we are the pawns on the chessboard, right? It would appear that way, based on the data. Again, there may be other facets or other types of interests, I guess you could say. Let's say, for example, one very common one is that we hear now is that protecting the planet. That they're warning us that we're destroying the planet, and that these things are, if we don't change our ways or anything that's understandable, right? It sounds logical until you look at the history. Again, if you were looking at this like, UFO encounters from the 70s, they all seem to be telling us the same thing. Well, there's some consistency there, yes, but you can go back in history quite a bit further and you see that the messages are always changing. And they're being presented in the same ways. And it seems as though they have the ability to do some pretty miraculous things. It seems as though that if they wanted us to stop doing something, they could stop us very easily.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem like that's quite the case. And a lot of times, as listeners will hear in some of the stories that we tell, things don't always pan out the way they say. Like there's an element of deception involved. And it seems as though it's some of these stories are simply the path of least resistance. It's sort of like a confidence game where they're trying to gain your trust so that you become invested. And at that point, you can be manipulated.
Yeah.
And I know that these are crazy sounding concepts, but again, that's why I like presenting the examples rather than just cutting to the chase. And
to me, they're not. I mean, I guess if someone is unfamiliar with all of it, then it might. But I guess, yeah, the protection thing, that the idea that they're sort of protecting us from ourselves or from nuclear war. I think even if you take a very literal sort of, as you would say, like nuts and bolts perspective on UFOs, that doesn't add up to me at all either. Really, from any way you look at it, that they're trying to protect us. I want to put to you like 3 or maybe 4 things that are all a bit perplexing and that maybe all kind of tie into what you were just talking about. Maybe they're not related, but well, one, you mentioned that there's the factions, you could loosely describe them as. I guess the first thing is, if there are these competing factions and they're continuing to compete, does that possibly imply that that is kind of all that they can ever do and that one side can never really win? Secondly, if they are in some way attempting to cause chaos or destruction or to cause war or to cause, then, and you kind of touched on this, but why are we still here? And thirdly, I can't remember what the third one was actually, but those first two, if does that not imply that this is kind of that this like perpetual conflict between these two kind of factions, like why the fact that it's not, that it hasn't ended, does that not imply that it kind of never will?
Well, obviously there are many potential interpretations of this, but one plausible scenario is that in order for us to, and I'm using the video game analogy again. In order for us to advance and to learn how to defeat our adversaries within the game, because the adversaries within the game could be entirely different than the adversaries outside of the game. But in order for us to achieve that, upgrade or a move up in levels, it may require some percentage of chaos, because order does not lend itself to advancement. It's like most of our greatest inventions have come about as a result of conflict, right? Needing to build a better mousetrap. And keep in mind that a lot of that very often, oddly enough, also is somehow inspired by these contact scenarios. Often in mathematics, we've seen it in space flight, we've seen it in a number of things. I've given on the show also a lot of examples of different very well-known individuals that most people don't know that they claim that the information was gifted to them. Mm-hmm. And it seems as though it's like this phenomenon is nudging us along. Now you can bring in the Enoch, the book of Enoch scenario, where the Watchers gave mankind forbidden knowledge, technology. So, and that can be cut different ways, but it could be interpreted that the one faction is providing mankind with the tools of their own destruction, self-destruction. It could be also, as we've talked about on the show, sort of like handing the baby the spork before you hand him the fork and knife, and it's just kind of dropping breadcrumbs to keep us on that path, to keep us moving, where we're not like cattle, where we're like, we have, my friends and I have this joke. We talk about cows, that cows never, unlike man, cows never really advanced, that they're basically the same as they've always been, because all their needs are met. All they want to do is sit there and eat grass all day. So there's no, if cows were somehow involved in some type of a struggle for survival, I mean, outside of within the parameters that they have control of course, we're their biggest adversary, but within that, they may have advanced. They may have eventually become more intelligent, out of necessity, right? So perhaps presenting us with these types of scenarios keeps that ball moving downfield, right? It may be perceived as negative from one perspective, but at the same time, it's still providing us with the answers in order for us to proceed along that path.
And there could be some aspect of the greater good that's incomprehensible to us, right? Maybe, or something the opposite.
Yeah. In that scenario of the hamster wheel and being caught in this, recurring, effectively like the Egyptians, you're stuck here until your heart is your soul is as light as a feather, and until you can move on to the next realm. So you're stuck in this perpetual state of reincarnation, right? And that could be interpreted almost like a purgatory, or or even could be considered hell, right? And from a religious perspective, and you're trying to achieve redemption. And once you reach a point where you feel you got it right, because based on a lot of the near-death experiencers and everything, Alex Sakaris talks about this, so I'm skeptical quite a bit, that it is ultimately you who judge yourself. You know how you led your life, and you know where you failed and where you could have done better. And also, it is in that concept that I just presented. From our level of on the playing field, we probably can't see this, but there's possibly a way to view it where death doesn't necessarily exist, not true death, and you're just stuck in this perpetual state of reincarnation. So if there's if player one that's playing this game that we're in, and I hate using a simulation scenario, but theoretically, it's like, and I've used this analogy before. You're playing a car game. I used to play what's it called, Gran Turismo a lot, right? And you're trying to beat your lap times, right? So you go, you take off, you somewhere along the line, you make a mistake. Sometimes the mistake is correctable. Other times it's not. And sometimes when you make a mistake and there's no way that you're not going to beat the time. And so you just hit reset, right? Nothing lost, nothing gained, right? Anything you gain some experience. Don't do that again, right? So maybe some of these things that we perceive as being terrible from our perspective, from this outer realm, looking down, looking in, they may not be as big of a deal. Like, you get and this is a hard concept to present without invoking some form of religion, right? But theoretically, the things that people go, oh, how could God allow this to happen? May have been like, what's the big deal? You get to start again and you just get it right next time. It's not, in other words, from that other level, from that higher level, it may seem insignificant. It's just from our level, it seems like it's a really big deal. It's the end, right? So I know these concepts get bigger and bigger and bigger
as you draw that out. Or
yeah,
even to the, I mean, you could say that based on, zooming out to the kind of outer, the absolute outest level, or just from one layer outside this reality, you might look at it from out there, and it would all make a lot more sense, as you say. It would, I guess, things that seem terrible to us, as you say, if you could see that those aren't all that there is, and they might have some place in a sort of in something larger, then they're not so bad necessarily. The third thing I was going to ask you about was the physical crafts, and you've mentioned this. You talked about this a lot on Brothers of the Serpent, but like, it's the thing that sometimes gives me pause, I guess, is all the murmurings from inside, like the Air Force and various other groups in the sort of US intelligence agencies and stuff, about there being physical crafts that have been recovered and physical objects. And I guess that perhaps muddies the waters a bit, or makes you think, well, if these things do have a real tangible physical presence, again, like, for example, why are we still here, or why aren't we seeing more of this physical presence, or how does this fit into alternative views of what they are? Is that something that you find difficult to fit into your perspective, or is it relatively?
No, I don't see the conflict. I know that that's a big stumbling block to to understanding of where I come from, in terms of my view of this whole scenario. And I don't see a contradiction. In other words, it's not a binary choice. And I think that that's something that we've discussed on the show quite a bit as well. But I think that we were essentially sold a bill of goods very early on that placed blinders on us, where we could only view the phenomenon in a binary sense. UFOs exist, UFOs don't exist. Mm-hmm. They're aliens from another planet, or they don't exist. In other words, there's always one or the other. It can't be all of the above scenarios. And I don't personally see a contradiction in a phenomenon that is both physical and non-physical, or that's non-physical but can manifest itself in our realm in a three-dimensional form. And I recognize this is a difficult concept to understand, but this is really no different than sending a fax. In other words, you could reach a level of intelligence, because it doesn't have to, again, this could start off as a non-physical intelligence that has existed for so long, or is outside of time. It just exists, and it has always existed, right? And it may have the ability to physically interact or create a physical reality as an experiment, or as for amusement. There's just a number of different scenarios, but it could create a physical reality, right? So once you've established that, if you can get past that concept, which is, if you can't get past that, then don't even try getting into religion, right? Don't join into religion, because that's what they're based on, right? This is a non-physical intelligence that created reality, physical reality. So if you've crossed that threshold, that a non-physical intelligence could have the intelligence to create a material reality, where do you draw the line of what it can and can't do? If it can create a universe and planets and stars and people and all this, it can't create an object that can fly around, or beings that can get out of the object. It's just, how does it want to interact with us? And that's, this argument that what are the odds that a non-human, that extraterrestrials would be, hominids? And like, well, in my scenario, they could be anything. And I've heard arguments, I big fan of Richard Dolan, right? He's a fantastic historian. I love his ability to just spout things off from memory because I'm not very good at that. Not good with names and dates. But I heard an interview with him recently, and he said, that he's not totally convinced that in kind of like the ancient alien scenario that this thing has been with us for, throughout history. He's not convinced because he doesn't see evidence of that. But then I started looking like, I'm surprised you would say that, because that argument only holds up if you are constraining the phenomenon to these disc-shaped craft and gray beings. As soon as you start saying, well, these are the airships of the past, these are the flaming shields of the past, these are the ghosts and fairies and gnomes and all these other things, then you start saying, well, it's the same thing presenting itself in a multitude of different ways. And it's always right at that limit of our technological understanding. And I find it, and it's funny because I've been saying this for quite a long time. I've had that perspective for a long time, but it's interesting how this is now panning out. As if you notice how often now you're hearing that the phenomenon might be some form of advanced AI. Why? Because we're developing AI now, right? So now that's that, cutting edge of technology. So, it's got to be that. It's obvious, right? That's no different than what they were saying 5,000 years ago when they were seeing these types of things.
They were seeing their most advanced technology in the sky.
Right.
Yeah, I guess some people get stuck because, or maybe not get stuck, but a lot of religious people I've noticed recently kind of classify the phenomenon as sort of Satan, basically, as Satan or demons, and as purely bad. And that because it's becoming so hard to ignore it now, even for people who are really desperate to believe that there's nothing and that this is all just made up by people. So I guess different people are having to, it's either it's all a government psyop, or it's demons or Satan, or it's simulation, and I guess the physical craft doesn't fit into most of those kind of viewpoints. But I guess, as you say, if you look at it as something even larger than that, that goes beyond that, it does make sense, and that it could manifest physically. Because you would ask yourself, well, if this was Satan, if Satan could manifest physically, if demons could manifest physically, why are we all still here? And it kind of doesn't make sense. But if you look at it from a wider perspective than that, then it does, I guess. But it's strange to have so much of it in the realm of our thoughts and our minds and ideas and deception and concepts. And then the idea that it's surreal, I guess it's surreal to imagine that there are these little pieces of things that people have that is in our possession. Did you hear the thing David Grush said about a craft that is about 20 feet in diameter, but when you get inside it, it's the size of a football field? And it's so surreal to imagine. I almost find it's crazier to imagine that everything is as has been explained by science, or alleged to have been explained by science. Everything, everything is just kind of random, and we just kind of were created out of nothing, and it was just this random event, and that there are just aliens. Aliens are real, and they live on another planet, and things have visited us. I find that's, to me, the craziest and most kind of intense scenario to imagine, and the idea that they really are just kind of what they say on the tin, and that we have these physical crafts. It's kind of like mind-blowing to think about and to imagine technology like that. Do you ever allow yourself to contemplate that, like that maybe that really is just what's happening? Maybe these are literally just extraterrestrial beings.
Again, that's a binary. You're offering up a binary choice, and it's hard. I know, because it's hard to not think that way. It's kind of the way we're programmed, right? But it's not a one, it's not an and, or it's not a one or the other. Are there extraterrestrials on other planets in the universe? I would say most definitely there are. Are they visiting Earth? Possibly, but what are the odds that, I don't know how many there are now to do it, but depending on who you listen to, there's 9 different species or 27 different species or 50 different, and they all conduct themselves exactly the same way. They interact with us in the same ways. They do the same things. They follow the same patterns. Very unlikely. And I think that people greatly underestimate the challenges of interstellar travel. Is it impossible? I wouldn't say it's impossible, but is it likely? Not. I would say it's not necessarily all that likely, because there are some major hurdles in propulsion. The ability to achieve the speed of light is probably the least. That's one that we can develop concepts for, but there are other challenges that are probably even more complex than that in terms of the time issues and the navigational issues and the communication issues and those kind of things. In other words, those type of things are, not only does it make it more difficult to consider the possibility that these could be some intelligence from very far away that's traveling like from one spot to the other here. To me, I look at this like I look, okay, here's a challenge, and there are all these obstacles to doing it in a conventional sense. And it's the saying that Stanton Friedman used to say, there, everything is impossible if you start off with all the wrong assumptions. So rather than trying to, how do we build faster rockets, and how do we, develop better ways of communicating over distance, what if you just say, you know what, we're going to take an out of the box approach. Maybe there's a better way. Maybe, when you're on the other side of the world from me, and you want to send me a message, or we want to have this conversation, you didn't say, well, I need to get on the fastest jet I can and fly over there so that we can have this command. Then I'll fly back, because there's going to be time loss. In other words, it's not practical. It's not practical. Maybe there's got to be a better way, right? So we developed this thing called the internet, right? Okay, so what if there is a way to do that is not limited by time or space or distance or anything? And there is this realm that we are within that lends itself to this form of communication, where now many different intelligences of different types with different agendas can all interact with us through the same conduit. So it all seems to fit the same patterns, because it's all coming through on the same channel, effectively. This is sort of
it's all
the
coming
scenario
from
I'm trying to build.
some kind of, it's like we're looking at all of it on the same phone screen, so it looks like it's all the same, but it's just all coming through the same device, so to speak. But that, surely you could apply that to some degree to either way of looking at things. You could apply that to the idea that this is all part of something larger, or you could say, well, if there are advanced civilizations, maybe they've just figured out how to manipulate space and time in that way. Do you know about the guy? I was reading that book In Plain Sight, and he mentioned, I think it was the guy who was like the head of Skunk Works or something at Lockheed Martin. I don't know if he was the head, but he worked for them and he used to do talks and stuff. And he said to somebody that they had kind of, he hinted that they had reverse engineered something. And he was known for, I think this guy was known for kind of messing around and joking around with people and kind of leading people up the garden path. But he said something along the lines of, he hinted they'd kind of begun some kind of reverse engineering process, and that what they saw was that these beings had taken the idea that everything in time and space is always connected, and that all time and space is at all times connected, and they found a way to exploit that.
What you're referring to was Ben Rich. Right. Ben Rich had a conversation with James Goodall, as an aviation expert that wrote for James Defense Weekly, and I think he was several books, and he spoke with Ben. Ben Rich actually made several somewhat related comments. He's also attributed, or there's a comment attributed to him where he said that anything you've seen in science fiction movies have been there and done that they're 50 years beyond what the public is aware of in terms of capability. And I think one of the quotes was, "We now have the technology to take ET home." So yes, and I'm trying to remember the exact quote that you were referring to. He asked him, how would interstellar travel work? And he said, do you know? He goes, how does ESP work? Yeah. And he said, everything is connected.
So he answered the question with a question, which was, yeah. But I guess that brings me on to my next question about kind of disclosure and these kinds of people. To what extent do you trust them? Do you have any expectations with regards to disclosure? Is it something that you're excited by, or do you feel that any kind of disclosure on behalf of the government will be kind of pointless, or how do you feel about that?
That's a big can of worms. I have a slightly different perspective, but that's again because I try not to put my chips on anything. So I just kind of watch scenarios play out, and it's all just data. And I recently made up a term for what I interpret is going on right now. And, if you're at all on Twitter or X now, and you see this playing out on a daily basis, minute by minute, I referred to it as ufological nihilism, where everything is a psyop, everything. And the problem with that, and I understand, I get it, right? Yes, government involvement and manipulation in this is definitely a real thing, but you can't use that as an excuse, or you can, but you shouldn't use that as an excuse to stop listening, because that is exactly what that is intended to do. Information overload, clog the channels of information where you can't tell which way is up, and it induces fatigue, and you quit listening, you quit paying attention. Every bit of disinformation has to contain some factual information. So just listen to everything, take notes, and then do your research and figure out what is there historical precedent for, and sounds like this is completely off the wall and there's nothing to support such a thing. All of these different things. There's, from my perspective, my opinion on this, and I could be entirely wrong, but I've been around the block a few times. I've seen these kind of things happen. They happen on a cyclical basis. This time is a little different, though. There's more movement this time. And I would say that my interpretation is that there are multiple agendas playing out simultaneously.
Yeah.
I believe that there are, the government is not monolithic. It does not have one party line and one agenda. There are many factions within the government, and a lot of times departments are in conflict with other departments within the same agencies. And so
almost never more so than with a phenomenon that seems to
Exactly.
exemplify that
Right.
more than anything else.
That was sort of going to be my closing sentiment. But the fact of the matter is that it appears that there are factions that are both pro and anti-disclosure. But even within those factions, there appear to be disagreements with the pace of this. Some people want disclosure now, and others say this needs to be done in a controlled manner. Information needs to be disseminated gradually, and there may be a multitude of reasons for this, and people speculate, as to what those things could be. And sometimes I think they discount certain things that they take lightly because they don't quite consider all of the ramifications. That sometimes, as much as I hate to admit it, there may be legitimate reasons to withhold certain information. And I'm not talking about strictly things that could be militarized or, that are matters of, national security. That's another point. Well, I'll have to get back to the national security thing in a minute. But the potential for disruptive technologies that could change the face of financial structures of the world. There are certain technologies that would completely change history. They would be a complete reversal of our financial systems. Our economies, global economies, are based on scarcity, on the concept of scarcity, right? The more scarce something is, the more value it has. And certain technologies could completely swap that around and to where we would, literally overnight, switch into a world of abundance where things like energy are virtually free. And there's a book by a self-made billionaire named Naveen Jan. It's a book called Moonshots, which I highly recommend for anybody that has an interest in this little aspect of, technology development. And he talks about that, living in a world of abundance. And he goes through all these different scenarios of how a change in one sector of the economy can have vast implications on facets of life we don't even consider. There's like this domino effect that when you change one thing, all of a sudden, all these other dominoes start falling and it changes everything. And I think that these potential things, not only, I know because of the nuts and bolts aspect of the phenomenon, we tend to always think of, it's going to change space flight or our ability, access to space and our ability to colonize and those kind of things. But there are other things like healthcare could be toppled completely. If all of a sudden there were a completely different approach to illness and organ, regrowing organs and, just all sorts of things. So I can understand that maybe there are certain aspects that, and I'm going to back up. I have a tendency to back up my statements, and so I get ahead of myself and then I have to back up. So it's entirely possible that some of the secrecy related to the phenomenon stemmed from an uncertainty, right? They hypothetical scenario going back to the 40s, let's say mid 40s, 45, maybe earlier, 47, there are recoveries of physical nuts and bolts material, right? And that may have led certain factions within the government, those that had access to the information. They may have logically assumed we will have a good understanding, a good handle of this pretty soon. So let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's not say anything yet. Let's start dissecting these things, and we'll get to that. We'll know in a matter of less than a decade. We will know. We will have all the answers. Well, hypothetically, as they started studying this, the more they studied it, the less they understood. And that could have persisted for decades. We may still be in that scenario where they know there's something, but they have no idea what it is, and there's nothing they could do about it. And so it's very difficult for somebody to come forward and say, yes, there's something, but we don't know. It's not a good position, right? I don't think very many politicians or world leaders want to be the one to have to acknowledge something like that. So it's also possible that somewhere along the line we started learning more. Maybe that knowledge came in different ways. Maybe it was not ascertained from nuts and bolts research. Maybe there were downloads or contact or other forms of education, right? And they may have eventually realized that this is something where you can only keep the genie in the bottle for so long. And there may eventually be a point where you are not, the governments have never been the ones in control of the information. Bottom line, the phenomenon is the one that's responsible for the lack of disclosure, because if they wanted to make their presence known, they would. But it appears that in this timeline of disclosure, there have been suggestions. I don't know that I buy it, that it's even if it's genuinely information that's being received, but there could potentially be some type of a deadline or something coming that would lend the tendency for them to want to disclose some, or they don't want to appear like they're totally in the dark. Yes, we are aware of this type scenario, right? So within that, there's multiple levels of complexity. And I think I'm fairly certain about this. I mean, this is an assumption, and there are only little bits of details here and there, but that might support this. But I think that some of the reluctance to move forward in that in the disclosure thing is that there's probably behind the scenes quite a bit of debate about who is going to take the fall, because somebody is going to have to fall on their sword over this. Regardless of how true some aspects that we've heard are, or whether there have been people killed and all sorts of illegalities related to this, someone is going to have to be held accountable for this. And it is entirely possible that there are agencies that are pointing fingers and say, I'm not taking the fall. You guys are the ones that did this part. And so, even if they recognize that, look, we can't keep the genie in the bottle forever, but I'm not the one that's going to go down. Or if I'm going down, you're going down with me type scenario. Those things are probably going on. Like from the disclosure side, that, the public tends to want this now thing. And they don't realize that it's this three-dimensional chess thing. You've got the private interests. You have these private corporations, defense contractors that are involved that may have things as Ross Coulthart has, emphasized quite a bit, that these shareholders of these private corporations, if disclosures were not made about some of this, there could be, considerable repercussions in terms of legal battles and, even potentially criminal charges, right, for defrauding, stockholders. So that's one aspect. The other is, do we even know that if these private corporations were trying to use these technologies, because let's look at the history, right? Look at the things historically that were developed for military use that over time became commercialized. I would imagine if I were one of these defense contractors that have commercial projects, Boeings and things like that, that if this technology has the ability to give me an upper hand in the marketplace from a commercial sense, there would be a motivation to try to disclose it, right? We want this out there. Or how can we incorporate certain aspects of this reverse engineered technology into day-to-day life? Well, it is possible that those contractors may not be allowed to do so and could be threatened by the government saying, no, you cannot go out and reveal classified information. This is our information that we handed over to you for you to develop. And so there could be arguments going on there. In other words, there are many different facets of the hurdles to disclosure. It's not simply, right. It's not simply like, oh, we don't want to acknowledge that there's something.
And I guess especially because it seems so cloistered in terms of who knows what, like, because so many of these micro organizations within other organizations are set up with total secrecy and everything's on a need to know basis. There could be one group that's discovered X and another group over here in a vacuum that have also discovered the same thing, and they have no line of communication with one another. And it's the one thing that seems to come up a lot is there's all these levels of access to information, and it seems like within that it creates as you mentioned, so many different factions and just so many different motives and so many different contexts and so many different ideas of what should or shouldn't happen. And there might be people who are kind of getting dragged kicking and screaming through disclosure by others who don't know what they know and who aren't allowed to know what they know, and who it's impossible legally and everything to impart this information to, and someone or some group has kind of just opened the door and shouted out, and then there's people in other organizations within organizations trying desperately, maybe for good reasons, maybe for bad reasons, or probably both in different, instances.
There's compartmentalization within these projects. They call it stovepiping. And very often, one company that may have been hired to work on a certain aspect may have no idea what the end product is. They're just working on this one component that in and of itself is probably couched as being part of some other program. That is done quite often. I contend that SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was Ronald Reagan's Star Wars program, was presented. You could hear, it was called Star Wars. It was referred to as Star Wars because there was a great deal of laser development involved. And I've presented some scenarios and some stories, some cases where it would appear that was a cover. They needed to develop the laser technology, yes, but that was because the laser technology had a direct application to the development of fusion technology. They use lasers for the containment. So that is how you white world a black project. You have this facet of it that you can be spoken of out in the open as being a secret, but it's really a disguise for something else. It's only a small piece of a bigger puzzle.
Interesting. Yeah. Oh man, it's been so interesting. There's just one more thing I want to ask you about before we wrap up. You mentioned on Brothers of the Serpent that You mentioned that, I guess, that to a lot of people, as we talked about earlier, this ties in or interacts with or possibly kind of causes conflict with their religious beliefs. You mentioned yourself, like, you believe in a creator of some kind. You weren't hugely specific about that. Do you, um, with all of this stuff in mind, and I guess with mainstream religions being the way that they are, like, generally, they seem to be, for the most part, kind of corrupt in some way. And then there's all this kind of other stuff, and everything's kind of, to me, it feels, I guess to most people, it feels like everything is kind of confusing and kind of muddled. How do you maintain any kind of faith? Do you, in your personal life, like, in the midst of all this and all this kind of weirdness and mystery and confusion, is there any constant grounding thing you're able to hold on to in a kind of spiritual sense or religious sense?
Yes, definitely. For me, the best tool is education. The more you learn about, oddly enough, you would think that the more you investigate the history of these religions, that you would get further from spirituality. And in my case, I think the more I learn, the greater sense of tangible reality that I get. Suffice to say that, and I've said this on the show many times, that not everything that I speak about in the show is hypothetical. Some aspects are interpretations or presented almost as analogies for personal experience. So sometimes these investigations are a search for personal answers. I agree with your perspective on religions, but we have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater on that. In other words, that the corruptions are often the result of agendas, human agendas, right? Yep. People trying to manipulate a system to their advantage or to elevate themselves within a community or a place of as an authority, or to disguise their own actions. There's lots of different ways that you can understand how you got to the point you're at today, right? But at the same time, you don't want to make the exception the rule, which happens quite a bit nowadays. People have a tendency of looking at one scenario, especially when it's on video, and you go, look, you see, they're all bad. And so you're scapegoating entire groups of people. And I think fundamentally, these people that are religious have good intention, even if there might be little aspects within that are not 100% correct to the true original teachings, or they still are fundamentally good people that want, in other words, don't, just because the leaders or certain might have done things.
Oh, I should know. Yeah, no, I don't feel that about the people at all. I feel, kind of broadly speaking, I'm a Christian. I just feel that if you look at what's been done in the name of it, you look at the history of it, it's hard to get away from the fact that the organization, the structure of all of these religions as a whole seems, it's I guess what I mean is it's hard to fully align yourself with any, for me personally anyway, it's hard to say, oh, I'm this, because there's always something stopping you from wanting to kind of sign your name on the dotted line. So for me, I feel you always have to come to your own conclusions and have your own relationship with that stuff. But that's difficult. It's a lot easier to just say, I'm this and this is my book and I believe this. But it's there seems to always be a reason or many reasons not to do that.
I agree with that sentiment entirely. There are legitimate reasons to not follow certain things, certain parts of religions that, and I'm trying to be as vague as possible because I don't want to single anyone out, because they all are guilty of this at one point or another, but they have been hijacked along the way very often by like governments, special interests from within that have their own agendas. And again, that doesn't change my perspective of and my belief in the creator. And so I would say I'm a spiritual person, but I also recognize the atrocities that have occurred throughout time as a result of conflict between my God is better than your God, or you believe in the wrong one, or whatever. But much like Bramley, the further you go back in that and you start to read and understand, how did we get here? How did this version of this religion come to be the way it is? And very often you'll be surprised that there were significant departures along the way from the initial teachings. And these are things we're actually about to get into in the podcast. I inch my way towards things. There's it's actually planned out. There's actually a script and with an outline of how these things connect, because I can't present the information haphazard because it wouldn't make any sense. There's such difficult concepts that, planning how you're going to present the information is really important. But
there must be a lot in that regard, though, relating to the phenomenon and everything you've talked about on the show with regards to the sort of perversion of religious teachings and religious figures and prophets. That then I would assume at a glance there must be a huge tie-in there with all of this. Yeah,
and it's really hard to talk about because in the past I'm just stating fact. In other words, I'm telling stories, factual stories. I'm not embellishing them or passing judgment in any way. I'm just strictly telling you, look, this is how these religions started. And you get pushback. There are people that get really offended because these are core beliefs, and it's sometimes you cannot stir that doubt in people's minds. They take offense to it because sometimes when you present the facts, it comes across as being like, you're right, this is what we were told. It's not. Again, that's not to say that there's not some factual basis, right? The fundamental belief might be correct. It's just the other related items that tend to get sketchy. I don't want to name names, but there are at least a couple of religions that are highly, highly sensitive to anything negative, or not negative. It just, again, there's facts, but
anything that challenges.
Well, they don't like acknowledging their origins. I'm not singling anyone out. I've touched on many different religions, including religions I'm associated with. So it's not. I'm not doing it in a malicious way. It's strictly to get a better understanding of our history and how the phenomenon may have been involved in the development of these religions. In other words, and I know that could be interpreted as somewhat suggesting that they're just a manipulation. Like, no, maybe, I guess using labels like, is it aliens pretending to be angels or angels pretending to be aliens? In other words, there are different ways to cut this, and the reality may be something not neither. It may be this hierarchy of other things that interact, that we have to use our historical lens, we apply our historical lens to it, and we end up having to use these labels for things because we don't have better terms for it. There's something somewhat intangible, right? And we have several thousand years worth of, referring to that kind of activity. It's like, people say, oh, yeah, how can you, call this ridiculous to say that these things are demons, right? To give you an example, I was going through this earlier. Let me pull up my notes here. As though this was a new concept that somehow demons would be associated with UFOs. In 1919, Charles Fort wrote the Book of the Damned, which, started the Fortean culture, right? And he had a term, see if I can pronounce this, Malenicus. And he's there's a quote here, and he said, let's see, he's talking about this super bat. He said, let it be that we have data of many dark bodies. Still we are inclined almost irresistibly to think of them as one of them as the dark body in chief, dark bodies floating or navigating in interplanetary space. And I conceive of one that is the prince of dark bodies, Malenicus. And Malenicus was Fort's term for demon. So here's 100-year-old. This is really before the modern age of ufology. And he's already making the association. So, these are definitely not new concepts. It doesn't mean that these things, when we say they're demons, it doesn't mean in a biblical sense. They could be just a form of intelligence that has a certain pattern of conduct that we have come to associate with demonology. Again, it sounds like a crazy concept till you get into the historical basis for these type of things.
Now, I always think about that when you talk about the deception aspect, like Satan was always referred to, or he was referred to as like something like the perpetual deceiver of mankind or something. And in the Bible, like references to Satan are very vague and few, and there's like this understanding of Satan that's sort of developed now as something much more than what's actually in the Bible. It is really referred to as just something that kind of deceives people more than anything, really, which is interesting with regards to the phenomenon.
Right. We're going to be, I've got a lot to say on that subject,
Sure.
But that's actually something we're going to be getting into soon on the podcast. I'm not trying not to give any spoilers, but there are definitely historical precedents for certain lines of thinking that involve that how these concepts came to be interpreted certain ways or presented in certain ways. And when you go back to the early writings, they were a little bit different. They've evolved over time, and they've been skewed certain ways. And sometimes things have been inverted from the original teachings and all. And it's very interesting how those things this sort of ties into the concept of, lesser gods, and how lesser gods, not creator gods, but rulers, right, could be perceived from a lesser point, from trying to think of a good way to put this without using any terminology that I'll be bringing up later. But there are definitely inclinations and suggestions of those type of like eternal battles that we hear about in sci-fi and that, even superhero type stuff.
Wow. Interesting. Well, yeah, it's been so great to have you on, Marty. Thanks so much for doing this. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you guys get into as well in the continuing series on Brothers of the Serpent. And again, I recommend anyone check it out. I've recommended it to a lot of people recently. That series, I think, it's a really good, as I said, a really good jumping off point. Even if you don't subscribe even at all to a similar viewpoint to you, I think it's just a really good jumping off point for UFOs because there's so much info in there. And any potential plans to turn it into a book at some point, maybe?
Yeah, all of this is more or less part of an outline to a book that keeps growing. Much like my first book, I was originally contracted to write a book that was between 160 and 180,000 words, and their first draft was 465,000 words or something. So I have a tendency to do that. I start to
you don't want to cap it off now, do you? Because you might stop and then you'll find something else out fascinating and you'll think, oh, I wish I'd put that in the book. Well, anyway, it'll be brilliant. I'm really looking forward to it. So yeah, thanks again for coming on.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on. This was a very good time.
You're welcome. Cheers. Yeah.